I stared at the termination letter in disbelief, my own signature mocking me from the company letterhead. Effective immediately, Sarah Chen is relieved of all duties as Chief Technology Officer of Innovate Tech Solutions. The boardroom felt suffocating as my stepmother Margaret's cold smile cut through me like a blade. "I'm sorry, darling, but the board has lost confidence in your leadership," she said, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table. "Your recent lapses in judgment have cost us three major clients. Lapses in judgment." The irony wasn't lost on me, not when I remembered everything from my previous life, including how this exact moment had played out before, how I'd walked out broken and defeated, only to watch helplessly as Margaret and my half-sister Jessica ran my company into the ground within 18 months. "The severance package is quite generous," Jessica added, barely containing her glee. At 26, she was 3 years younger than me, but had somehow convinced the board she was ready to take over as CTO. "We're offering you 6 months' salary." 6 months! For the company I'd built from nothing, the revolutionary AI platform I'd coded in my dorm room while they were spending daddy's money on designer handbags. But this time was different. This time, I knew exactly what was coming. The first time I lived this moment, I was 29 years old, crushed and naive. I'd taken their money and watched from the sidelines as they destroyed everything I'd worked for. The stress of losing my life's work, combined with the betrayal, had literally killed me. A massive heart attack at 31, alone in a cramped studio apartment, scrolling through news articles about Innovate Tech's bankruptcy. I'd woken up on my 21st birthday, 8 years in the past, with every memory intact. Every betrayal, every board meeting, every line of code I'd written. More importantly, I knew every mistake I was going to make, every person who would stab me in the back, and exactly how to prevent it all. The abuse had started long before the company. My father, Richard Chen, had remarried Margaret when I was 12, bringing Jessica into our lives like a beautiful poison. My mother had died when I was 10 cancer, quick and brutal, leaving Dad and me to figure out life together. For 2 years, it had been just us against the world. He'd taught me to code on his old computer, encouraged my interest in mathematics, told me I could build anything I could imagine. Then Margaret arrived. She was everything my mother hadn't been. Glamorous where Mom had been practical, manipulative where Mom had been straightforward, cold where Mom had been warm. She came with Jessica, then 8 years old and already showing signs of the narcissistic personality that would define her adult life. Margaret's strategy was subtle but devastating. She never directly attacked me, that would have been too obvious. Instead, she systematically undermined my relationship with my father through 1,000 tiny cuts. When I showed Dad a program I'd written, Margaret would interrupt with something Jessica needed. When I earned academic awards, she'd find ways to minimize them while magnifying Jessica's much smaller achievements. When I struggled with typical teenage awkwardness, she'd position herself as the understanding stepmother while painting me as difficult and rebellious. The worst part was watching my father slowly buy into her narrative. The man who'd once encouraged my ambitions began to see my drive as obsessive. My academic success became unhealthy pressure I was putting on myself. My plans for starting a tech company were unrealistic dreams that I needed to abandon for something more practical. Meanwhile, Jessica was positioned as the perfect daughter, social, agreeable, beautiful. It didn't matter that her grades were mediocre or that she showed no particular talents or interests. In Margaret's world, being pleasant and attractive was more valuable than being brilliant and driven. While I buried myself in books and code, Jessica learned to manipulate and charm. She discovered early that she could take credit for my achievements with just the right combination of false modesty and strategic timing. When I won the state computer science competition, Jessica made sure to mention to everyone how she'd helped me practice. When I got accepted to MIT with a full scholarship, she somehow became part of the story. The supportive sister who'd encouraged me through my stress and anxiety. By the time I graduated MIT with a computer science degree at 21, the family dynamic was set in stone. I was the difficult genius who needed to be managed and contained. Jessica was the golden child whose success was inevitable and whose setbacks were always someone else's fault. When I announced my plans to start a tech company, Dad seemed supportive. He even offered to invest, putting up the initial capital for Innovate Tech Solutions. What I didn't realize until it was too late was that Margaret had convinced him to structure the investment in a way that gave her and Jessica controlling interest while I did all the work. The paperwork was complex, filled with legal jargon that my 21-year-old self had trusted my father to handle fairly. There were different classes of shares, voting rights that seemed to favor technical expertise but actually defaulted to business experience, and a board structure that looked democratic but was actually designed to marginalize me. For 8 years, I'd been the brilliant mind behind the scenes while they took credit, built relationships, and positioned themselves as the true leaders of the company. I'd been too focused on the technology to pay attention to the politics. Every major breakthrough I achieved was somehow transformed into a team effort, with Jessica playing an increasingly prominent role. Every client I landed through technical innovation became a win for their business development strategy. I'd created the AI platform that made Innovate Tech valuable, but Margaret and Jessica had created the narrative that made them indispensable. By the time I realized what was happening, they'd already consolidated enough power to push me out entirely. In my previous life, by the time I understood the true nature of their betrayal, it was too late. I'd fought back desperately, trying to reclaim what was mine, but I was playing a game where I didn't understand the rules and they'd already stacked the deck. The stress of the battle, combined with the isolation and betrayal, had destroyed my health. The heart attack that killed me at 31 was just the final punctuation mark on a slow assassination that had taken years to complete. But this time, I'd been planning for 8 years. The moment I woke up in my college dorm with my memories intact, I'd started building my real empire. Instead of pouring everything into Innovate Tech, I'd been more strategic. I still founded the company, had to maintain the timeline and keep them from becoming suspicious. But I'd also been quietly building a portfolio of investments and contacts that my family knew nothing about. Every revolutionary startup I remembered from my previous life, I'd gotten in early. Every stock that would boom, every cryptocurrency before it exploded, every patent that would become essential. I'd positioned myself carefully using different names, shell companies, and offshore accounts. The first investment had been the hardest. I was 21 with limited capital and no investment history. But I'd used my knowledge of Bitcoin's early days to get in when it was trading for pennies, then carefully diversified into other opportunities I knew would pay off. By the time I was 23, I had enough capital to start making serious moves. I'd invested in Uber before it was called Uber, getting in during the seed round when Travis Kalanick was still figuring out the business model. I'd bought shares in Tesla when Elon Musk was just another Silicon Valley dreamer with big ideas and bigger risks. I'd gotten into Google's IPO, Amazon before anyone understood cloud computing, and dozens of smaller companies that would become essential pieces of the modern tech ecosystem. The key was patience and diversification. I couldn't make every investment personally. That would have created patterns that might have been noticed. Instead, I'd built a network of investment vehicles, each with different focuses and strategies. Sarah Chen might be known as a talented but naive young tech founder, but behind the scenes, I controlled a growing empire of carefully orchestrated bets on the future. While they thought I was just their brilliant but naive daughter grinding away at code, I'd been building an empire that would dwarf anything they could imagine. Every slight, every moment of manipulation, every credit stolen, I'd been storing it all up, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Standing in that boardroom, holding my termination letter, I smiled. "Actually," I said, folding the letter neatly, "I declined the severance package." Margaret's eyebrow arched. "Excuse me? I don't need your money." I gathered my laptop and the few personal items from the conference table. "I'll be fine." Jessica laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Sarah, don't be ridiculous. You don't have any other options. This is the best offer you're going to get." If only she knew. Through my carefully constructed network of investments and shell companies, I now controlled a venture capital fund worth over $2 billion. More importantly, I held strategic positions in every major tech company that Innovate Tech would desperately need as partners. The fund, Meridian Capital, had been my masterpiece of financial engineering. Officially, it was managed by Marcus Rivera, a brilliant analyst I'd met during a Stanford guest lecture, and carefully recruited over several years. Marcus believed he was working for a consortium of anonymous investors who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. He had no idea that the mysterious benefactors funding his operations were all controlled by the same person, me. "We'll see," I said simply, and walked out. As I left the building that had been my second home for 8 years, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The charade was finally over. No more pretending to be grateful for their support. No more watching Jessica take credit for my innovations. No more enduring Margaret's passive-aggressive comments disguised as motherly concern. The war I'd been preparing for was about to begin. The first phase of my plan activated immediately. Within 24 hours of my termination, I began systematically dismantling every relationship Innovate Tech had with the tech ecosystem. Not openly. That would be too obvious. Instead, I used my influence through my various investment vehicles to create complications. Zenith Systems, the cloud infrastructure company that hosted all of Innovate Tech's services, I owned 30% of it through Meridian Capital. The CEO, Amanda Walsh, was someone I'd personally recruited from Oracle 3 years earlier, offering her the chance to build something revolutionary with unlimited resources. She was brilliant, ambitious, and completely loyal to the vision I'd helped her articulate. A quiet word to Amanda about reliability concerns regarding smaller clients who might not be positioned for long-term growth. And suddenly, Innovate Tech's hosting costs tripled overnight. It wasn't personal, I explained to her. It was just smart business to focus resources on clients with stronger fundamentals and better growth prospects. The AI chip manufacturer they relied on for their hardware? Neural Forge had been a 3-person startup when I first invested in them 5 years ago. Now they were one of the most sought-after suppliers in the industry, and I was still their largest shareholder. When production capacity became limited due to unprecedented demand, it was only natural that they'd prioritize their most strategic customers. Innovate Tech, unfortunately, no longer qualified for that tier of service. The software licensing deals they needed to stay competitive. I had board seats or major stakes in half their vendors. Contract renewals became surprisingly difficult to negotiate, with terms that were technically fair but practically devastating. When you're operating on thin margins, a 20% increase in licensing costs can be the difference between profitability and crisis. Each move was carefully calculated to appear like normal market dynamics. No single action was obviously targeted at Innovate Tech specifically. But the cumulative effect was like watching a perfectly engineered demolition. Everything appeared stable until the moment it all came crashing down at once. Margaret called me after the first week, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "What are you doing, Sarah?" I was sitting in my penthouse office. Yes, I own the building too, purchased through another shell company 3 years earlier. Watching the San Francisco skyline while my team of analysts provided real-time updates on Innovate Tech's rapidly deteriorating situation. The office itself was a masterpiece of strategic positioning. Located in the heart of Soma, it offered panoramic views of both the Bay Bridge and the towers of downtown. The building housed a carefully curated selection of startups and established companies, all connected through my investment network. Walking through the lobby felt like touring a museum of my future victories. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said innocently, swiveling in my chair to watch a delivery drone navigate between the skyscrapers. "I'm just focusing on my new venture capital career." "Don't play games with me. Our hosting costs have gone insane. 3 of our suppliers are suddenly having issues, and 2 of our biggest licensing partners won't return our calls." That does sound unfortunate. Maybe Jessica's leadership is already showing results. The silence on the other end was delicious. I could practically hear Margaret's mind racing, trying to figure out how her difficult stepdaughter could possibly have this kind of influence. "Sarah, whatever you think you're doing." "I'm not doing anything, Margaret. I'm just investing in promising companies and advising them on their strategic partnerships. It's amazing how much influence you can have in Silicon Valley when you really understand the ecosystem." That was the beautiful irony of their situation. They'd spent 8 years positioning me as the brilliant but naive technical founder who didn't understand business. They'd painted themselves as the savvy operators who knew how to navigate relationships and politics. But they'd fundamentally misunderstood what kind of relationships actually mattered in the tech world. Margaret and Jessica excelled at cocktail party networking and surface level charm. They could work a room, remember names, and make small talk that made people feel important. But the real power in Silicon Valley didn't flow through charity galas and social events. It flowed through technical innovation, strategic investments, and the complex web of interdependencies that connected every successful company to dozens of others. While they'd been playing social politics, I'd been building real influence. Every engineer I'd mentored who went on to found their own company. Every early stage investment that had grown into a unicorn. Every technical breakthrough that had enabled new business models. These relationships weren't based on charm or manipulation. They were based on mutual value creation and genuine respect for technical excellence. I hung up and immediately called Marcus. Marcus, it's time for phase 2. Marcus Rivera had been one of my closest friends in my previous life, until Margaret convinced him I was becoming unstable and hired him away from me. In that timeline, losing Marcus had been one of the most painful betrayals, partly because I'd seen it coming but been powerless to prevent it. This time, I'd recruited him first, offering him triple his previous salary and equity that would make him wealthy beyond his dreams. More importantly, I'd given him something he'd never had before, the resources and freedom to build something truly revolutionary. Marcus was a financial genius with the soul of an artist. In his previous jobs, he'd been constrained by conservative investors and short-term thinking. At Meridian Capital, I'd given him a mandate to find and fund the kinds of transformative technologies that could reshape entire industries. The results had been spectacular. How much liquidity do we have? I asked. About 800 million ready to deploy immediately. Another billion we can access within 2 weeks if needed. The numbers still felt surreal, even after years of watching my net worth compound. $800 million. More money than most people could comprehend, and it was just the liquid portion of my holdings. The total value of my investment portfolio had crossed into the tens of billions, spread across hundreds of companies and carefully structured to avoid unwanted attention. Perfect. Start buying up Innovate Tech's debt. This was the beautiful irony of their situation. To fuel their rapid expansion after pushing me out, they'd taken on significant debt financing. Corporate bonds, bank loans, venture debt. It was all tradable if you knew where to look and had the capital to make serious offers. The debt had been necessary because, despite their confident projections, Innovate Tech was burning through cash faster than they were generating revenue. Without my technical leadership, they'd been forced to hire expensive consultants to maintain the AI platform. Without my relationships with key suppliers, their costs had increased across the board. Without my reputation for innovation, they'd struggled to command premium pricing from clients. They'd covered these challenges by borrowing against future growth, confident that their business expertise would eventually overcome any technical shortcomings. Now that confidence was about to become their downfall, buy everything you can find, I continued. If someone owns Innovate Tech debt, I want them to get an offer they can't refuse. Anonymous purchases through our network of shell companies. I want to own their entire debt structure. That's aggressive, Marcus said, though I could hear the admiration in his voice. When they find out, they won't until it's too late, and by then, I'll control their entire financial future. The debt acquisition strategy was more complex than it might have seemed. Innovate Tech's debt was held by dozens of different entities, banks, private lenders, institutional investors, and even some individual bondholders. Each required a different approach and a different acquisition vehicle. For the bank loans, I used 3 separate investment funds, each with different geographic focuses and investment profiles. The banks saw what appeared to be unrelated entities making competitive offers for debt portfolios. They were happy to move off their books. For the corporate bonds, I worked through a network of bond traders and institutional investors, purchasing through secondary markets at prices that reflected growing concerns about Innovate Tech's financial stability. For the venture debt, I leveraged relationships with firms that specialized in tech lending, positioning myself as a sophisticated investor looking to acquire performing debt at a discount. The key was making each transaction appear independent and market-driven. No single entity was buying enough debt to raise red flags, and each acquisition was structured to look like normal portfolio management rather than a coordinated attack. While Marcus worked on acquiring their debt, I activated the next phase. Through my network of portfolio companies, I began systematically hiring away Innovate Tech's best talent, not their mediocre middle management. I wanted their truly brilliant engineers and developers. This required a more subtle approach than the financial warfare. The tech talent market was incredibly tight, and the best engineers always had multiple options. The challenge was making offers that were so compelling that people would abandon secure positions for unknown opportunities. I didn't even have to offer outrageous salaries, though the compensation packages were certainly generous. What I offered was something more valuable: the chance to work on truly cutting edge projects with unlimited resources and complete creative freedom. Word was already spreading through Silicon Valley that Innovate Tech was having difficulties. When you're a top engineer and you get an offer from a hot startup backed by Meridian Capital, a fund with an almost mythical reputation for picking winners, you don't hesitate. The recruitment strategy was surgical in its precision. I wasn't trying to destroy Innovate Tech's entire workforce. That would have been obvious and potentially illegal. Instead, I was targeting the 15 to 20 people whose departure would cripple their ability to maintain and innovate on the AI platform. Dr. James Liu, the machine learning architect who'd helped me refine the core algorithms, he received an offer to lead AI research at a stealth mode startup working on breakthrough applications in autonomous systems. The equity package alone was worth more than he'd make in 5 years at Innovate Tech. Sophia Reyes, the brilliant systems engineer who kept our infrastructure running, she was recruited to build the next-generation cloud platform for a company that was positioning itself to compete directly with Amazon Web Services. Michael O'Brien, the data scientist whose work on natural language processing had been crucial to our client deployments, he got the chance to work on a project that could revolutionize human-computer interaction, with resources that made Innovate Tech's R&D budget look like pocket change. Each recruitment was handled through different channels and different companies, making it difficult to see the pattern. To outside observers, it looked like Innovate Tech was simply losing talent to the usual competitive pressures of the Silicon Valley job market. But I knew exactly what their departure would mean. These weren't just employees. They were the keepers of institutional knowledge, the people who understood not just what the AI platform did, but how it worked and why it mattered. Without them, Jessica would be trying to manage a system she fundamentally didn't understand, supported by a team that lacked the deep expertise necessary to maintain it. Jessica, in her new role as CTO, was about to discover that having a title and actually being able to do the job were very different things. In my previous life, she'd managed to coast for a while by taking credit for work that others did and relying on the technical team to keep things running smoothly. But when the talent drain started, her complete lack of technical competence would become obvious very quickly. The third week after my termination, I received the call I'd been waiting for. "Sarah, we need to talk." Dad's voice was strained in a way I'd never heard before. "About what?" "You know what. Please. Can we meet for lunch?" Richard Chen had built a small fortune in traditional manufacturing before I was born, but he'd never really understood the tech world. His success had come from producing physical goods, precision components for aerospace and automotive industries. It was a business model that made sense to him. Raw materials went in one end, finished products came out the other, and success was measured in units sold and profit margins. The tech industry's emphasis on intangible assets, network effects, and platform economics had always mystified him. He understood that my AI platform was valuable, but he couldn't quite grasp why or how that value could fluctuate so dramatically based on factors that seemed completely disconnected from the underlying technology. In my previous life, I'd resented him for choosing Margaret over me, for allowing them to push me out. But now I felt something closer to pity. He was about to lose everything he'd invested in my company, and he had no idea why. We met at the same upscale restaurant where he'd first told me about his engagement to Margaret 17 years ago. Chez Laurent was the kind of place where San Francisco's elite went to be seen, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs, with a wine list that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He looked older than I remembered, grayer, with deep worry lines around his eyes. The confident manufacturer who'd built a business empire through hard work and practical intelligence had been replaced by a man who was clearly out of his depth. "Sarah, I know you're upset about how things ended at Innovate Tech." "I'm not upset, Dad. I'm grateful." He blinked. "Grateful?" "They did me a favor, forced me to realize that I was thinking too small." I sipped my wine, a vintage that cost more than most people made in a month. I've been learning a lot about the venture capital world lately. It's fascinating how much power you can wield when you control the flow of money. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was drinking wine that probably cost more than what many families spent on groceries in a month, while explaining to my father how I'd learned to weaponize wealth against his wife and stepdaughter. In my previous life, I'd died alone in a studio apartment, eating ramen noodles and scrolling through news about my company's bankruptcy. The contrast was almost dizzying. What are you talking about? I pulled out my phone and showed him a news article that had just been published. Did you see TechCrunch today? Apparently, Innovate Tech is facing some serious challenges. Stock price down 60% in 3 weeks, major talent exodus, supply chain issues. The article speculates that they might be facing bankruptcy within 6 months. Dad's face went pale as he read the headline: Innovate Tech Solutions, from AI darling to distressed asset in record time. The subhead was even more brutal. Industry analysts question company's viability as key personnel exodus continues. That's impossible. The company is solid. Jessica says they're just going through a temporary rough patch. Jessica. I laughed, not kindly. Dad, Jessica couldn't code her way out of a paper bag. The only reason Innovate Tech succeeded in the first place was because of the AI platform I built. Now that I'm gone, what exactly did you think would happen? But she has the team. Had the team. About 70% of our senior engineers have quit in the last month. Apparently, they're all getting incredible offers from companies backed by this mysterious new VC fund called Meridian Capital. Have you heard of them? I watched the pieces click together in his mind. His face went through several interesting color changes as he started to understand what I was implying. The realization was beautiful to watch. Dad was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He'd built a successful business by understanding systems and relationships, by seeing how different pieces fit together to create value. As he stared at the article and thought about the timing of everything that had gone wrong for Innovate Tech, I could see him starting to grasp the scope of what I'd accomplished. Sarah, what have you done? I've become exactly what you always wanted me to be, Dad. A successful businesswoman, just not in the way you expected. The truth was more complex than even he could have imagined. Over the past 8 years, I hadn't just built wealth. I'd built influence. Every investment I'd made, every relationship I'd cultivated, every favor I'd done for emerging companies had been part of a larger strategy to position myself at the center of Silicon Valley's power structure. When you control billions of dollars in investment capital, people listen to you. When your fund has a track record of turning startups into unicorns, entrepreneurs line up for the chance to pitch you. When your portfolio companies become essential infrastructure for entire industries, you have leverage that goes far beyond your formal ownership stakes. I'd spent years carefully building this network, making myself indispensable to dozens of companies while remaining virtually invisible to the general public. Meridian Capital was known in investment circles as one of the most successful funds in Silicon Valley, but very few people knew who was really behind it. That night, Margaret called me directly. "You little bitch," she hissed, all pretense of motherly concern gone. "I know what you're doing." "Really? What am I doing, Margaret?" "You're sabotaging the company out of spite." "I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm just making smart investments and business decisions. If that happens to negatively impact Innovate Tech, well, that's just the free market at work." The beautiful thing about using economic pressure rather than direct attacks was that everything I was doing was perfectly legal and defensible. I wasn't hacking their systems or spreading false information. I wasn't threatening their employees or vandalizing their property. I was simply exercising my rights as an investor and business owner to make decisions that maximized value for my stakeholders. This is about more than business, and you know it. For the first time since this all began, I let some real emotion creep into my voice. You're right. This is about 18 years of psychological abuse. This is about watching you systematically undermine my confidence while building up Jessica's ego. This is about you convincing my father that I was the problem child while your daughter was perfect. The words came out with more force than I'd intended, carrying years of suppressed rage and pain. Even with all my success, even with the power I'd accumulated, The wounds they'd inflicted still ran deep. Jessica is Jessica is a mediocre narcissist who's about to discover what happens when you're in over your head. But you're the real architect of this family's dysfunction. You saw a lonely widower with a brilliant daughter and decided she was a threat to your own child's future. Margaret's strategy had been so insidious precisely because it was so subtle. She'd never directly attacked me or obviously favored Jessica. Instead, she'd used 1,000 tiny manipulations to shift the family dynamic in her favor. A comment here about how I was too intense. A suggestion there that Jessica needed more support because she was more sensitive. Over time, these small interventions had added up to a complete reframing of our family relationships. My academic achievements became evidence of my obsessive personality. My technical interest became proof that I was antisocial. My ambitions became symptoms of my unrealistic expectations. Meanwhile, Jessica's mediocrity was reframed as well-rounded development. Her social focus was evidence of her emotional intelligence. Her lack of clear direction was proof of her open-minded approach to life. You're delusional. I'm successful, there's a difference, and I'm about to be much more successful. I hung up and immediately called Marcus. How much of their debt do we control now? 87%. We should have the rest within a few days. Good, and our short positions? All in place. When they announce their Q3 results next week, the market reaction should be dramatic. The short positions had been the riskiest part of my strategy, but also potentially the most profitable. I'd been carefully building positions that would pay off if Innovate Tech's stock price collapsed, using a complex network of derivatives and options that made it nearly impossible to trace back to me. Short selling was always dangerous because your potential losses were theoretically unlimited. But when you had inside knowledge of exactly what was going to happen to a company's operations, financial position, and market relationships, the risk calculation changed dramatically. Perfect. It's time for the final phase. The fourth month after my termination, Innovate Tech announced their quarterly results. The numbers were catastrophic. Revenue down 40%. Most of their major clients had switched to competitors, and their burn rate was unsustainable. More importantly, their debt obligations were about to become very problematic. The earnings call was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak and panic barely held in check. Jessica, trying to sound confident while clearly reading from prepared remarks, explained that the company was going through a strategic transition that would position them for long-term sustainable growth. Margaret, speaking as the interim CEO, blamed the challenges on market headwinds and competitive pressures, while assuring investors that the company's fundamental value proposition remained strong. I listened to the call from my office, taking notes on their increasingly desperate attempts to explain away the obvious. Every question from analysts was met with evasive answers and promises of detailed follow-up that never materialized. The stock price dropped 12% during the call itself, and another 8% in after-hours trading. But the real devastation came from the debt covenants. Most of Innovate Tech's borrowing agreements included provisions that kicked in if the company's financial performance fell below certain thresholds. Revenue targets, cash flow minimums, debt-to-equity ratios, all designed to protect lenders from exactly the kind of deterioration that was now happening. As the holder of most of their debt, I had the right to accelerate repayment schedules, demand additional collateral, or force various other actions that would put enormous pressure on their cash flow. The beauty of it was that I wasn't doing anything vindictive or unreasonable. I was simply exercising standard creditor rights that any rational investor would use to protect their interests. I was sitting in the Meridian Capital conference room with my team when Margaret, Jessica, and Dad arrived for our meeting. They thought they were meeting with potential investors who might save their company. They had no idea they were walking into a trap I'd spent 8 years planning. The conference room was designed to intimidate floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, a table that could seat 20 people, and walls lined with awards and recognition from industry organizations. Every detail had been carefully chosen to project power and success. Margaret looked haggard, her usually perfect appearance showing cracks. The expensive suit and professional makeup couldn't hide the stress lines around her eyes or the tension in her posture. Jessica seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of responsibilities she couldn't handle. The confident young woman who'd always been able to charm her way out of difficult situations was clearly struggling with problems that couldn't be solved through manipulation. Dad just looked old and defeated. The man who'd once commanded respect in his industry had been reduced to a bit player in a drama he didn't understand. "Thank you for agreeing to see us," Margaret began, her voice carefully controlled. "As you know, Innovate Tech has been facing some temporary challenges, but we believe with the right investment partner—" "Actually," I interrupted, rising from my chair at the head of the table, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The moment of recognition was beautiful. Margaret's face went through shock, denial, rage, and finally a kind of sick understanding. Jessica just stared, her mouth slightly open like a fish gasping for air. It took Dad the longest to process what he was seeing. His eyes moved from me to the Meridian Capital logo on the wall, to the financial reports spread across the conference table, to the team of analysts and lawyers sitting around me. I could see him trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the woman who was clearly in control of this room. "Hello, family," I said pleasantly. "I thought it was time we had an honest conversation about Innovate Tech's future." "This is impossible," Jessica whispered. "You can't, you don't have this kind of money." "Don't I?" I gestured to the wall of monitors behind me, each showing different aspects of my financial empire. Real-time portfolio values, market positions, cash flow projections. The visual representation of 8 years of careful planning and strategic investment. Meridian Capital currently manages just over $2 billion in assets. We have positions in 47 tech companies, including controlling stakes in 12 unicorns. And as of yesterday, we own 96% of Innovate Tech's outstanding debt. The silence in the room was profound. I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, the distant sound of traffic on the street below, the soft clicking of keyboards from the analysts monitoring market data. Margaret was the first to find her voice. "This is impossible. You're 29 years old. No one accumulates this kind of wealth and influence that quickly." "You're right," I said. "No one does it that quickly. That's why I started 8 years ago." I walked over to one of the monitors and pulled up a timeline of Meridian Capital's major investments. Bitcoin at $3, Tesla at 12, Uber's Series A, Google's IPO, Amazon before AWS, Facebook's first round of institutional funding. Each investment was marked with entry and exit dates, showing returns that ranged from modest wins to spectacular home runs. The overall performance was so consistent and prescient that it looked almost supernatural. The key was having perfect information about which technologies would matter and which companies would execute successfully. It turns out that when you know exactly what's going to happen, it's surprisingly easy to make money. Dad found his voice first. "Sarah, what do you want?" "What do I want?" I walked around the table slowly, savoring this moment I'd dreamed about for 8 years. "I want justice. I want accountability. I want the people who destroyed my life to understand exactly what they've lost." I stopped in front of Margaret. "You spent 18 years teaching me that I wasn't good enough, that I was too difficult, too ambitious, too threatening. You made me believe that I needed to be grateful for whatever scraps of affection I could get from my own family." The words came easily now, backed by years of accumulated anger and the absolute confidence that came from holding all the power in the room. "Every time I achieved something, you found a way to diminish it. Every time I showed promise, you redirected attention to Jessica. Every time I needed support, you made sure I knew that I was asking for too much, that I should be more understanding of other people's needs." I moved to Jessica. "And you. You spent your entire life riding on my achievements while pretending they were yours. Every award I won that you claimed credit for, every project I completed that you put your name on, every moment when you basked in praise for work I did." Jessica's face had gone completely white. I didn't mean, you didn't mean to destroy my confidence? You didn't mean to steal my accomplishments? You didn't mean to convince everyone that you were the real talent in the family?" My voice remained calm, but the words cut like surgical instruments. "Or you didn't mean to get caught?" Finally, I faced my father. "And you let it all happen. You chose them over me again and again, because it was easier than standing up to Margaret's manipulation." "Sarah, please," Dad started. I'm not finished." My voice cut through the room like ice. Innovate Tech is bankrupt. Your debt obligations exceed your assets by about $200 million. Normally, that would mean liquidation, lawsuits, and financial ruin for everyone involved. I returned to my seat and pulled out a folder of documents. Fortunately for you, Meridian Capital is prepared to make an offer. Margaret leaned forward, desperation creeping into her eyes. What kind of offer? A complete buyout. We'll assume all debt, pay off all creditors, and retain all employees who want to stay. The company will be reorganized under new management and continue operating. The relief that flickered across their faces was almost comical. They still didn't understand that this wasn't a rescue, it was an execution. That's generous, Dad said cautiously. What do you want in return? I smiled. Everything. I slid the contract across the table. Total ownership transfer to Meridian Capital. All shares, all intellectual property, all assets. In exchange, you walk away debt-free, but with nothing else. That's insane, Jessica exploded. The company is worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for it, I said calmly. And since we're the only entity with enough capital to prevent bankruptcy and criminal liability for fraudulent financial statements, we're the only bidder. Margaret's face had gone completely white. Criminal liability? Oh, yes. Turns out that some of those rosy projections you gave to investors weren't entirely accurate. The SEC is very interested in companies that misrepresent their financial position to secure additional funding. I pulled out another document from my folder. This is a forensic accounting report on Innovate Tech's books for the past 18 months. Very interesting reading. Revenue recognition irregularities, expense classifications that don't match industry standards, projected cash flows that assumed client renewals you knew were unlikely. The report was real. I'd commissioned it from one of the top forensic accounting firms in the country. When you control enough debt to force a company into bankruptcy, you have the right to conduct detailed financial audits. What they'd found was even worse than I'd expected. The good news is that as new owners, Meridian Capital would be willing to cooperate fully with any investigation and ensure that past management mistakes don't reflect on current operations. We'd position the acquisition as a rescue of valuable technology from failed leadership, which would actually protect the company's reputation and employee base. The room fell silent except for the sound of Jessica's rapid breathing. You can't do this, she whispered. I can. I am. The question is whether you sign voluntarily or wait for the bankruptcy court to force the liquidation. I leaned back in my chair. Either way, you lose everything. This way, at least you avoid prison. Dad was reading through the contract with shaking hands. The legal language was dense, but the implications were clear: total surrender, in exchange for avoiding complete financial ruin. Sarah, why are you doing this to us? For a moment, the mask slipped. For a moment, I'd let them see the pain they'd caused, the years of humiliation and betrayal that had led to this moment. Because you took everything from me first, I said quietly. My company, my confidence, my family, my life. You taught me that love was conditional, that success had to be earned through submission, that I could never be enough. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. But you made one crucial mistake. You underestimated me. You thought that because you could manipulate and control me, that meant I was weak. You never realized that I was learning from every betrayal, growing stronger from every humiliation. The view from the 42nd floor was spectacular. San Francisco spread out below me like a circuit board, all glowing connections and flowing data. Somewhere out there were hundreds of companies I'd invested in, thousands of people whose careers I'd helped launch, millions of users whose lives had been improved by technologies I'd funded. This isn't revenge. This is justice. This is you finally experiencing the consequences of your choices. Margaret tried one last manipulation. Sarah, sweetheart, I know you're angry, but we're family. No. My voice was absolute. Family doesn't destroy each other. Family doesn't systematically tear down a child's self-worth. Family doesn't steal credit for achievements. You stopped being my family the moment you decided I was expendable. I turned back to face them, and for the first time in this entire confrontation, I let my real feelings show. Years of suppressed rage, pain, and determination burned in my eyes. You want to know what the worst part was? It wasn't the stolen credit or the manipulation or even the betrayal. It was watching you convince my father that I was the problem, that my ambition was unhealthy, my success was threatening, my very existence was somehow making everyone else's life more difficult. Dad flinched as if I'd struck him. You made me feel like I had to choose between being successful and being loved. You taught me that my achievements only mattered if they made other people comfortable. You convinced me that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of approval you decided to give me. I walked back to the table and placed my hands flat on its surface, leaning forward to look each of them in the eye. But here's what you never understood. I didn't need your approval. I never did. I needed your respect, your support, your recognition of what I was capable of achieving. Instead, you gave me a masterclass in how power really works in this world. The contract signing took 20 minutes. Margaret signed with tears streaming down her face, her signature shaky and uncertain. Jessica could barely hold the pen, her hands trembling as she signed away any claim to the company she'd thought would be her inheritance. Dad's signature was the steadiest of the three, resigned but firm. As they prepared to leave, I called out one final time. "Margaret!" She turned back, hope flickering in her eyes for just a moment. "The penthouse apartment you're living in? The one in Dad's name that you love so much? Meridian Capital owns the building. Your lease expires next month." The hope died instantly, replaced by a look of such devastation that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Jessica, my half-sister, looked at me with pure hatred, but underneath it, I could see something else. Fear. For the first time in her life, she was facing consequences she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. That startup you interviewed with last week? The one that seemed so promising? We're their primary investor. I made sure they knew about your limited technical capabilities. Jessica's face crumpled. "You can't do this to me. I'm your sister." "You're Margaret's daughter," I corrected, "and you made your choice a long time ago." She walked out without another word, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. "Dad!" He paused at the door, looking older than his 65 years. For a moment, I saw the man who'd taught me to code on his old computer, who'd encouraged my early interest in mathematics, who'd once told me I could build anything I could imagine. "I'm sorry it came to this." For a moment, his face softened. "Sarah, I'm sorry you chose them over me. I'm sorry you let Margaret poison our relationship. I'm sorry you never stood up for your own daughter." I took a breath. "But I'm not sorry for winning." He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of 17 years of mistakes and missed opportunities, and left. After they were gone, I stood alone in the conference room for several minutes, processing what had just happened. The victory felt different than I'd expected, less triumphant, more final. Like closing a door that I'd never be able to open again. Marcus knocked and entered quietly. "How do you feel?" "Successful," I said after a moment, "and completely alone." "You don't have to be alone. You've built something incredible here. You have a team of people who respect and admire you. You have the resources to do anything you want with your life." He was right, of course, but success was a strange companion. It gave you everything you thought you wanted while taking away everything you thought you needed. The transformation of Innovate Tech into Chen Dynamics took 6 months. I brought in new leadership, restructured the technology platform, and repositioned the company as a next-generation AI solutions provider. The rebrand was more than cosmetic. It represented a fundamental shift from the company my family had tried to build to the vision I'd always had for the technology. Within a year, Chen Dynamics had not only recovered its lost clients, but had expanded into 3 new market segments. The AI platform, freed from the constraints of my family's limited imagination, evolved into something far more powerful than it had ever been under their control. The key was treating technology as a means to solve real problems, rather than as a product to be sold. Margaret and Jessica had always approached the business with a sales-first mentality. Figure out what clients wanted to hear, then promise to deliver it. I approached it from an engineering perspective. Identify the fundamental challenges people were facing, then build solutions that were so effective they became indispensable. And the difference in outcomes was dramatic. Under the old management, Innovate Tech had been a moderately successful vendor in a crowded market. Under my direction, Chen Dynamics became a platform that other companies built their own innovations on top of. 2 years later, I stood on the same balcony where I'd planned their downfall, looking out over a city that had completely transformed my understanding of power and success. Chen Dynamics had become one of the most valuable AI companies in the world. The platform I'd originally coded in my dorm room, combined with the resources and vision of Meridian Capital, had revolutionized 3 different industries and was expanding into 2 more. Healthcare was the first breakthrough. By applying machine learning to diagnostic imaging, we'd created systems that could identify cancers, neurological disorders, and genetic abnormalities earlier and more accurately than human doctors. The technology was already being deployed in hospitals across North America and Europe, saving thousands of lives each year. Financial services came next. Our fraud detection algorithms were so sophisticated that they could identify suspicious patterns in real time, preventing billions of dollars in losses while reducing false positives by 90%. Every major bank and credit card company in the world was either using our technology or desperately trying to develop something comparable. The third breakthrough was in autonomous systems. Our AI platform had solved several key challenges in self-driving cars, robotic manufacturing, and drone operations. The Department of Defense had classified much of our work in this area, but the civilian applications were already transforming logistics and transportation. We employed over 8,000 people globally and had a market valuation approaching $50 billion. I was 34 years old and worth more money than most small countries. Forbes had named me one of the most influential women in tech. Harvard Business School taught case studies about my acquisition strategy and business philosophy. More importantly, I was happy, not the simple happiness of achieving goals or accumulating wealth, but the deeper satisfaction of knowing that I was using my capabilities to their fullest extent. Every day brought new challenges that required the kind of technical innovation and strategic thinking that had always energized me. I'd learned to surround myself with people who valued excellence over manipulation, who celebrated my successes instead of trying to claim them. My leadership team at Chen Dynamics was brilliant, ambitious, and completely loyal. Not because they feared me, but because I'd created an environment where their success contributed to something larger than themselves. Dr. James Liu had become our chief AI officer, leading a team of researchers who were pushing the boundaries of machine learning in ways that wouldn't have been possible at a traditional tech company. Sophia Reyes was our chief technology officer, managing infrastructure that supported millions of daily users across dozens of different applications. Michael O'Brien headed our natural language processing division, working on projects that could revolutionize how humans interact with computers. These weren't just employees, they were collaborators and, in many cases, friends. People who understood what I was trying to build and who brought their own vision and expertise to make it better than I could have achieved alone. I'd also used my wealth to fund scholarship programs for women in STEM, particularly those from dysfunctional families. The Sarah Chen Foundation provided not just financial support, but mentorship and networking opportunities for young women who showed exceptional promise in technical fields. I knew what it was like to have your achievements undermined and your confidence systematically destroyed. If I could prevent even one brilliant young woman from going through what I had, it was worth every dollar. The scholarship recipients were already making their mark. Maria Santos, a young programmer from East LA, whose family had tried to discourage her technical interests, was now leading AI research at MIT. Jennifer Kim, whose parents had wanted her to pursue a more suitable career in healthcare, was developing breakthrough applications in quantum computing. Sarah Williams, yes, I'd specifically looked for scholarship candidates who shared my name, was building the next generation of sustainable energy technologies. Each success story felt like a small victory against the forces that had tried to contain my own ambitions. Every young woman who achieved her potential despite family pressure or social expectations was proof that talent and determination could overcome even the most systematic attempts at suppression. The tech industry had embraced me not as someone who'd survived abuse, but as a visionary leader who'd changed the game entirely. My speeches at conferences focused on innovation and ethical leadership. My interviews in business magazines discussed market strategies and technological disruption. The painful family drama that had motivated my rise was a private victory known only to me. Sometimes, late at night in my penthouse office, I'd think about the alternative timeline, the one where I died young and broken, where Margaret and Jessica had destroyed everything I'd built. That version of me had been brilliant but naive, talented but vulnerable. She'd believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to protect her from those who wanted to tear her down. This version of me knew better. This version understood that sometimes the only way to defeat evil was to become more powerful than your enemies could imagine. This version had learned that the best revenge wasn't just success. It was becoming so successful that your enemy's worst fears about you seemed laughably small in comparison. Margaret had moved back to her hometown in Ohio, where she worked as a real estate agent and lived in a modest two-bedroom house. The divorce from Dad had been ugly and expensive for her. Without the Innovate Tech income or the lifestyle it had supported, she'd been forced to confront the reality of her limited skills and options. The last I heard, she was dating a man who managed a hardware store and drove a 10-year-old Toyota. Her social media showed a life of carefully managed mediocrity, with posts about local community events and discount shopping that couldn't quite hide the underlying desperation. Sometimes I wondered if she understood what had really happened to her. Did she grasp that her systematic undermining of my confidence had ultimately created the very enemy she'd feared I might become? Did she realize that by teaching me to see love as conditional and success as something to be earned through submission, she'd actually motivated me to become completely self-sufficient and ruthlessly strategic? Probably not. People like Margaret rarely developed that kind of self-awareness. It was much easier to see herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control than to acknowledge her role in creating the forces that had destroyed her. Jessica had struggled to find work in tech after word spread about her incompetence. The Silicon Valley gossip network was remarkably efficient, and her brief tenure as CTO of a failing company had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of nepotism and credential inflation. She'd eventually taken a job as a marketing coordinator at a small firm in Portland, making about 1/10 of what she'd expected her career to bring her. Her LinkedIn profile was a masterpiece of euphemistic language, describing her experience as pivoting to focus on strategic communications and brand development. Her social media showed a life of carefully managed mediocrity and quiet desperation. Photos of hiking trips and coffee shops that were clearly designed to project an image of contentment and success, but which couldn't quite hide the underlying anxiety and disappointment. The saddest part was that Jessica probably could have had a decent career if she'd focused on developing real skills instead of riding on my achievements. She wasn't stupid, just lazy and entitled. In a different timeline with different choices, she might have found work that suited her actual capabilities and interests. But that would have required acknowledging her limitations and working to overcome them, something she'd never learned to do. Margaret had taught her that charm and manipulation were more valuable than competence and effort. Now she was discovering that the real world didn't always agree with that assessment. Dad had tried to reach out several times over the years, letters, emails, attempts to contact me through mutual friends. I'd ignored them all for the first 3 years. When I finally read one of his messages, it was a rambling apology that showed he still didn't truly understand what he'd done wrong. He wrote about missing me, about regretting the way things had ended, about wanting to rebuild our relationship. But there was no acknowledgement of the specific choices he'd made, no recognition of how his passivity had enabled Margaret's psychological warfare. He'd moved to a retirement community in Arizona and spent his days playing golf with other men who'd made similar mistakes. His emails described a life of comfortable mediocrity, with enough money to maintain his lifestyle but no real purpose or direction. The most recent communication had been a birthday card with a handwritten note. "I know I failed you as a father. I think about you every day and I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Even though I don't deserve any credit for it, I hope someday you can forgive me." I'd kept the card but never responded. Some wounds were too deep for simple apologies to heal, especially when the person apologizing still didn't fully understand what they were apologizing for. But my real victory wasn't their defeat, it was my own transformation. 3 years after the acquisition, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I stepped back from day-to-day operations at Chen Dynamics, transitioning to chairman while promoting Dr. Liu to CEO. It wasn't retirement. At 34, I had decades of productive work ahead of me. It was evolution. I'd proven everything I needed to prove about my ability to build and lead a successful company. Now I wanted to explore what else I could accomplish with the resources and influence I'd accumulated. The transition was smoother than anyone expected. I'd spent years building systems and developing people specifically to avoid the trap of becoming indispensable. Chen Dynamics continued to grow and innovate under new leadership, proving that the value I'd created was sustainable rather than dependent on my personal involvement. My new focus was longer term and more ambitious. Through the Sarah Chen Foundation, I was funding research into fundamental questions about artificial intelligence, consciousness, and the future of human-computer interaction. I was also investing in breakthrough technologies that might not pay off for decades, but could reshape civilization if successful. Climate change mitigation was a major focus. I was funding everything from advanced nuclear reactor designs to atmospheric carbon capture systems to revolutionary approaches to sustainable agriculture. The goal wasn't just to reduce humanity's environmental impact, but to develop technologies that could actively reverse the damage we'd already done. Space exploration was another passion project. I was partnering with several aerospace companies to develop technologies that could make human expansion beyond Earth economically viable. Not just getting to Mars, but building self-sustaining colonies that could eventually become independent of Earth's resources. The most speculative investments were in life extension research. I was funding studies into the biological mechanisms of aging, with the goal of not just extending human lifespan, but maintaining health and cognitive function throughout that extended life. All of this work was motivated by a simple realization. I'd spent 8 years focused on destroying my enemies and building my own power. Now, I wanted to spend the rest of my life using that power to solve problems that actually mattered. The work was challenging in ways that business success had never been. Scientific research was full of failures and dead ends. Many of the projects I funded would never produce useful results. But the potential payoff technologies that could improve or extend millions of lives made the risk worthwhile. I was also discovering that using wealth and influence for altruistic purposes brought its own kind of satisfaction. When one of my funded research teams achieved a breakthrough in cancer treatment, or when a scholarship recipient published groundbreaking research, or when a climate technology I'd supported showed promising results, the sense of accomplishment was different from business success, but equally rewarding. 5 years later, I stood on the same balcony where I'd planned their downfall, looking out over a city that had completely transformed my understanding of power and success. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. The Beijing expansion is approved. We're looking at another $5 billion in valuation. I smiled and put the phone away. Chen Dynamics had become everything I'd envisioned and more, but it was no longer the center of my world. Tomorrow, I had meetings with 3 heads of state about implementing our AI platform in their national infrastructure. Next week, I was keynoting a conference on the future of human-AI collaboration. Next month, I was breaking ground on a new research facility that would employ 2,000 of the world's brightest minds. Margaret had been right about one thing. I was too ambitious for my own good. She just hadn't realized that was exactly what would make me unstoppable. The girl who'd been fired from her own company was gone. In her place stood a woman who owned an empire, who wielded power with precision and purpose, who'd turned her deepest wounds into her greatest weapons. But more than that, I'd become someone who understood that true victory wasn't just about defeating your enemies. It was about becoming so successful, so influential, so fundamentally powerful that your enemies became irrelevant. Margaret, Jessica, and Dad weren't threats anymore. They weren't even obstacles. They were just people I used to know, living smaller lives while I shaped the future. The real triumph wasn't that I'd destroyed them. It was that I'd grown beyond them so completely that their approval or disapproval simply didn't matter anymore. And I was just getting started.